Hello, my name is Sam Stone, and this is my final project for Harvard University CSCI E159, Cybersecurity, Intrusion, Hacking, and Detection. I'm going to talk about the recent open source software supply chain attack on XC recently launched around April 1st, 2024. I'm going to start with a little background on XC and then go into how the exploit was executed. I'm going to talk a little bit about some other recent open source supply chain attacks and refer to some topics that we discussed in class. And I'll end with a conclusion on some recommendations I think that would prevent something like this in the future. So XCUtils, it's an underlying library called LZMA, and they're both open source software code that implemented when the LZMA compression and decompression, a tool used for compressing and decompressing streams. The potential impact of the exploit was so significant because XCUtils was extremely popular with developers and automatically included in most Linux distributions. And it's widely used in the Linux ecosystem. So it had the potential to be a very large attack and would render any system operating on Linux under its control. So a bad actor, more likely a team of bad actors, used a social engineering scheme and developed some fake open source software contributor profiles and built trust over a period of about 2 years. And they got the trust of Lassie Collin, the lead founder and the manager of XCUtils. And one of the fake profiles, Gia posed helpful contributions over time and was able to elevate his access to commit, which gave him free rein to make changes to the open source software code without any review, without any approvals. And because Colin was often away, that gave the hackers great latitude to execute these attacks. And so they were able to install a backdoor in XCUtils. And with XCUtils, the LZMA, as I mentioned before, that's the library. In it is a command that most Linux distributions use along with the API library, right? And so a lot of software rely on this library to execute compression, including SSHD. And that's how the discoverer actually found it, because he was working on some SSHD efficiencies, trying to benchmark those. And he noticed that the issue was actually coming from XCUtils. So the hackers planted malicious code in the tarball, which is what most people install and download. And the malicious code actually wasn't in the source code, so it wouldn't have been picked up by regular scanning. So the hacker used a series of obfuscations to hide the malicious code. And when the actual code would go into build, the system would execute an object that was disguised as a test file. And so this test file, when it launched, it granted the hacker the ability to modify specific parts of the LZMA code, and that would allow the hacker to also intercept and modify any data that was interacting with that LZMA library. So the hackers also went through extreme lengths to make it impossible for anyone to kind of track their activity, because the only way that you could actually execute the backdoor was using the hacker's private key. So it was impossible to really monitor or test, right? And as I mentioned before, Freund was the one, he was a Microsoft researcher looking at this, looking at, benchmarking, SSHD logins and trying to understand why it was taking up so much resources. And he ultimately found it, reported it, did some research on it. So that was a very good, important thing that he did. So some other recent supply chain software attacks, open source software attacks, were Equifax. There was a data breach caused by a vulnerability in the Apache struts, an open source web application framework. And it enabled hackers to get in, get all kinds of personally identifiable data, social security numbers, credit card numbers, birth dates. 2021, we have SolarWinds, another example where hackers injected a backdoor into their Orion software and it provided them with unauthorized access to some sensitive data that they compromised, and that was several public and private institutions worldwide were impacted by that. And then more recently in 2021, Log4j. So the Log4 shell vulnerability was when it was Log4j was a widely used component in numerous applications, and hackers injected malicious code into the log message, which caused arbitrary code execution to be written when they would execute the malicious code. And that enabled the hackers to take over all of these systems. And this relates to a number of the topics we discussed in class. And this was really a fun thing to look at in research, because the XCUtils exploit, it relates to code injection, certainly relates to stored attacks. I mean, the hackers were methodically planning this over time. And then they thoughtfully and carefully and patiently waited as they changed and modified the code. Public and private key encryption, right? So the hackers encrypted the back door and made it impossible for anyone to send anything out without having the hacker's private key. Malware, certainly, the test file that they injected that would execute at build status. Certainly open source software benefits, disadvantages of it. While, this probably leans a little bit closer to a disadvantage, I mean, I still feel with the proper controls and better security, open source software can be very beneficial and useful. Bug bounty programs, while this wasn't a specific bug bounty program, certainly the ethical hacking efforts of Andreas Freud, definitely ties to cyber ethics, and he identified the threat, shared it, and it was definitely for the greater good of society. There's also a connection to work that package managers do in terms of sandboxing more harmful things and kind of preventing people from downloading programs or software that may be harmful. So in terms of recommendations, I have a number of them. There's actually a law that was proposed in 2023, and it's actually focused around enhancing CISA's role in the oversight and strengthening of open source software security. So, making CISA the central point of contact, really eliminates some of these duplicative efforts with other agencies and kind of help them direct, full governance and a framework and getting robust control to CISA, that'll help provide some effective guardrails for OSS and also foster greater collaboration and innovation within the OSS community, because they'll know that CISA is the resource and the governing body. But until that becomes a law, right, there's still some things that can be done. So Free Software Foundation and open source initiatives, I think they could take some steps to enhance registration standards for participation in open source code software development. For instance, tighter authentication and access requirements for open source software code development. Linux Foundation, Mozilla, Debian platforms and operation system suppliers should, the ones that widely use open source software should do some risk assessments with greater regularity that focus on assessing code libraries and their essentialness to the operation, categorizing and identifying potential risks, and their resiliency capabilities should be one of the libraries. If one of the libraries becomes compromised, what the impact of that malicious code would be, how quickly they can identify those things and how they can impact and triage and clean those systems. So in terms of software development, so incentivizing best practices in open source software code development, leveraging NIST, software security development standards framework, ensuring that code is being developed in segregated and hardened environments. For example, using machines that are sole purposes to develop code, isn't multitasked or bogged down by performing other functions, which could increase the attack vector for hackers. Ensuring code development is consistent and repeatable process and has strong controls. Update the change management process. Who can update, who can make changes. Some strong encryption around accesses to either ensure that creator approver roles aren't easily compromised. Have strong code reviews and scanning and process in place, While it's impossible to review all code, make sure that there's a strong governance process that has a reviewer either sampling or reviewing a good majority of the code. And then if the code libraries are copied, there are strong authentication and verification practices used to ensure that the code library copied are in fact from an authentic source. Make sure that the code scanning tools are able to be read in languages in which the code was written and properly highlight any obfuscated code or lines that were recently added that include improper or inconsistent commands. Run the code multiple machines and multiple environments independently to ensure that they match and are in fact the code that was intended to be published. And then lastly, on the security side, only download software that has code signatures, ensure that you're getting the right code. Use threat tracking services to detect anomalies and verify source code changes and tracking. And strong identification and access management controls around contributors through some rudimentary screening of social media platforms, LinkedIn profiles, verification of contributors' certifications. Hell, that can go a long way and help prevent future exploits like the XY utils exploit. Thank you.